Okay, looks like our waiting room is slowing down, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kathy Boyce. I am director at GridWorks, and I am joined today by my colleagues Steve Black and Matt Jones. We will be providing facilitation support for today's meeting. This is a study session for the Colorado Electric Transmission Authority. We are here today to understand revenue bonding as a tool for CETA and to hear reactions from experts, board members, and the public and answer some initial questions. I'm going to hand it to Maury Galbraith here in just a minute to elaborate on the purpose of this work. But first, a little bit of housekeeping, if you'll indulge me. We are recording this meeting and we'll be posting it on the CETA's website shortly. So you can also find today's agenda and slide deck at the white paper. And thank you, Matt. There's the link for you to find all of those materials. Our agenda today includes time for experts to share their findings, a brief reaction panel, time for board members to ask questions and provide some initial reactions, and then time for the public to also ask their questions and provide their initial thoughts. So for now, if I may please ask you to keep yourself muted, and we will invite speakers at different points throughout the session this morning to come on camera and offer your thoughts. So please hold your questions until the appropriate time. And with that, Maury, I'm going to hand it to you.
Okay, thank you, Kathy. Welcome, CETA board members and stakeholders. I want to use my opening remarks today to put this study session in context. This is the beginning of our journey to explore the strategic uses of CETA's Revenue Bonding Authority. The Grid Strategies and Energy Sites white paper covers the fundamentals of using revenue bonds to finance transmission development. Next steps for CETA include hiring financial consultants and bond counsel to assist CETA in developing standardized bond products and building a project execution track record. I anticipate that CETA's use of revenue bonding will be highly dependent on the specific needs of our transmission development partners. I also anticipate that a significant amount of CETA's state fiscal year 27 funding will be allocated to building and advancing our public financing platform. So again, this is just the beginning, a lot more to come. Kathy, I'll turn it back to you and to let you introduce today's presenters. Thank you.
Thank you, Maury. Yes, let's turn to the white paper and the findings, the foundation for this work. I'll invite the Grid Strategies and Energites team to turn on their cameras and join us.
Great, welcome all. I'm Rob Gramlich, President of Grid Strategies, and it's an honor for us to work with CETA here and with all of you. I'm going to turn the presentation over to Nathan Shreve here on our team, and Soham Goel is our expert who we've known and worked with for years, and anytime I have a transmission finance question, I've turned to Soham, so that's why he's here working with us as well. Nathan, I'm not sure if we need more in terms of bios, but maybe we should just dive in.
Yeah, sure. Why don't I turn it over to Soham just to kick us off with a little bit of intro framing.
Thank you, Nathan. And good morning, good afternoon to all. Glad we could do this. There's a lot of work that the team has put together in coming up with the white paper as well as some guidance that we're going to share as a presentation. By way of background, I'll be very brief, but to just give you some context of my background so that you have a sense of where the comments are coming from. I have been in this industry for about 3 decades, worked as a consultant, as a financier, as well as a developer of transmission. I've guided a $30 billion loan program in the DOE for greenfield transmission. Worked as a developer with a pension fund that was focused on building infrastructure in the US, and originated a transmission project with Goldman Sachs. In New Mexico, it's a project that is actually up and running now, and currently I'm involved in a bunch of greenfield transmission projects. Just a few things to highlight before we dive into the presentation and walk through some of our analysis and findings and share it with you. Just want to start by sharing at the outset that I'm of the belief that transmission build in the US needs all the support it can get. We have passed so many incentive regulations and created so many programs, but the number of miles that have been built in the US are dismal that's kind of where we stand right now. So in that context, I'm basically a fan of transmission authorities. I've worked closely with New Mexico Renewable Energy Transmission Authority. I see Eric on the line here. And, you know, having said that, I would just say we should be clear-eyed and be specific about the role and economic benefits that such an authority could create. There are three things I just want to highlight, three themes that would come through as we go through the presentation. The first one is public financing. In our minds, it's a broad term, and there are different kinds of public financing. And so our paper and our work is very focused on CETA and its statute and what is possible and what's not. It's not a analysis of public financing in general. So I just want to make sure that we frame it as such. The other thing I just want to highlight is also when we say transmission project, that in our minds is also a fairly broad term covering a spectrum from high risk merchant projects to regulated low risk projects. And so it's, we can talk in terms of transmission projects, but just keep in mind as we go through it that there's a big spectrum of projects there. And the last third concept I just want to share is that, there is a point about timing. A greenfield project goes from a piece of paper to being built, and there is a lot that goes on between those two endpoints in that journey. And so the risk profile changes along the way. So that's kind of the third thing I just want us to keep in mind as we go through our analysis and look at some of our findings. So our focus has been clearly on CETA statute and how best it can benefit Colorado and how best it could enable transmission projects. Obviously, such an authority can't just solve all the problems, but it can actually, in a strategic and selective way, go a long way to making projects happen. So let me pause there and I'll turn this over back to Nathan to take us through our analysis and findings.
Thank you so much, Som. And thank you, Kathy and Maury, for kicking us off today. I'm going to share my screen here. Please let me know if you have any difficulty viewing it. But building off of what Som said, today's presentation is really to think about and answer the question of how CETA can best use its public revenue bonding authority to accelerate transmission development in the state of Colorado. So just as some background and some context before we dive into our analysis, I'll start here and just say that, as we all know, CETA is a political subdivision of the state. It has statutory authority to issue revenue bonds, designate transmission corridors, coordinate multi-party transmission development, and under Colorado Revised Statutes, Section 4042-104, it has full statutory authority to issue and sell transmission bonds up to 30 years in term with fixed or flexible interest rates. These bonds are payable only from CETA funds and do not create state debt or obligations. This distinction here is really important, and I'll come back to it in a future slide. But before I get there, I'll just touch briefly on the mechanism of how the bonding authority works. In that a dedicated bond fund is created, which serves as kind of a source and sink for funds. A source or a sink in the sense that project revenues, fees, and bond proceeds will flow into that bond fund, and a source in the sense that money will flow out of that fund as it is pledged to bond repayment. And then one more interesting thing to note about CETA's bonds is that they are exempt from state and local taxation. Interest on the bonds is exempt from state and local taxation. This improves after-tax investor returns, and we'll discuss further along in the presentation the implications for this tax treatment. Now, as I mentioned, these bonds are payable only from CETA funds and do not create state debt or obligations. And this distinction is really important because it speaks to the two different types of bonds that public bonding authorities can issue. On one hand, you have general obligation bonds, which are repaid from the general funds of the issuing government, and are backed by the full faith and credit of the state, including the state taxing power. And then on the other hand, you have revenue bonds. These are the kinds of bonds that CETA can issue. And what's distinct about revenue bonds is that repayment is solely based on revenues generated by the specific projects that they finance. So if CETA were to issue X million dollars of revenue bonds to take a X% stake in a project, the revenues from that project, after it is developed, constructed, and reaches execution, would then be used to pay the debt service on those bonds. These bonds are not backed by the taxing authority of the state. They're not backed by the state balance sheet. And so this distinction, this varying these two different levels of risk, create an important difference between investor behavior around these two bonds. On one side, with general obligation bonds, they're seen as having a relatively lower level of credit risk than revenue bonds because revenue is guaranteed, it's certain. These bonds are backed by the full faith and credit of the state, and therefore investors will demand lower interest rates than they will for revenue bonds, which are seen as a higher credit risk. If a project were to, for some reason, not reach execution and revenues weren't able to flow, investors will price this in to the bonds and therefore demand higher interest rates for these revenue bonds. So this distinction in the relationship between risk and investor demands speaks and can be really extrapolated to the broader world of transmission financing, in which financing terms are determined by investor perception of repayment certainty. Transmission requires an extraordinarily large amount of upfront capital years before project revenues begin. It can take 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 plus years to build a transmission line and before it starts generating revenue. And in that time period, projects are exposed to permitting risks, regulatory risks, cost recovery uncertainty, regional cost allocation outcomes, all kinds of risks that are integrated and factored into financing terms, including interest rates, investor appetite, required return, as these financing terms are fundamentally driven by the investor perception of project uncertainty and project risk. So if you think about projects on a spectrum from lower risk to higher risk, on the left-hand side here in this image at the bottom, we have projects with regulated tariffs or long-term contracts that can attract lower cost debt on their own because of high repayment uncertainty. On the right-hand side of this image, we conversely have projects that advance without any secured revenue, such as merchant projects that must rely more heavily on high-cost equity in earlier stages of development, if they can even be financed at all, if investors are even willing to put up capital to drive the project forward. And these projects will, in theory, post-development, secure revenues based on the market problem that they address, but advancing development with sole reliance on equity in earlier stages can be expensive and can be challenging. And so during development, if these projects are able to surmount and overcome those barriers, they will move from the right-hand side of the spectrum to the left-hand side as risk falls over time, and the cost of capital will fall accordingly in tandem. But again, this can really only happen if earlier risks and any capital gaps during the development process can be bridged cost effectively. So as part of this work, we've outlined 4 different buckets that we use to categorize transmission projects based on this idea that repayment certainty depends upon and is driven by project revenue models. We have merchant projects, which often face greater difficulty securing earlier stage financing as they are relatively higher risk compared to regulated incumbent projects, which are relatively lower risk. So I'll just walk through each of these buckets really quickly to give you a flavor for the types of projects that are within each category, and then talk about what the implications are for strategic use cases of CETA's bonding authority and how they can provide support and play across each of these categories. So on the left-hand side, we have regulated models. These regulated incumbent projects are characterized by having a FERC or state rate-based return awarded to incumbent utilities. These IOU and utility investments generally carry relatively low risk, and therefore because they can secure debt directly against their own balance sheets. Um, as we move up the spectrum, we have regulated competitive projects, which experience a FERC rate-based return with competitive procurement run by a regional planner or state agency, for either incumbent utilities or for non-incumbent developers. So again, these competitive regulated projects are either selected through like an ISO or RTO procurement, and require project bidders to expend capital upfront before revenue is secured, which is why we have them as characterized as slightly more risky than regulated incumbent projects. On the right-hand side, you have merchant models, which include merchant build, own, transfer lines. Now, in this bucket, a non-incumbent developer will come in and build, own, and then transfer a transmission project to an incumbent utility for regulated cost recovery. An example of this might be the Western Spirit Line in New Mexico, where the New Mexico RETA partnered with Pattern Energy to develop the Western Spirit Line, build it, and then eventually sold it and transferred it to the Public Service Company of New Mexico, for placement in rate base for regulated cost recovery. And then finally, here on the far right-hand side, we have merchant offtake models in which a non-incumbent developer will secure revenue agreements through open access sale of transmission capacity. And these offtake projects face ongoing counterparty and capacity utilization risk. And investors really aren't going to be willing to engage with these kinds of projects, oftentimes unless certain threshold contracted volumes are met. So each of these different buckets presents distinct financing barriers and also distinct opportunities for CETA to support and add and unlock value. So what we see is that CETA can supply, and this is the core thesis of our paper, is that CETA can supply structured, selective, risk-tolerant capital to unlock projects that private markets may find challenging. And you can see this broken out across three different use cases. CETA's revenue bonding authority really has an opportunity to create meaningful value by partnering with transmission developers to strategically address different stages of the development cycle where conventional capital might be scarce, might be expensive, and its value really lies in complementing rather than displacing existing financing approaches. And you can see that in our example use case number one, where CETA can support earlier stage projects that are in earlier stage development. And these could include merchant build and transfer models or merchant offtake projects, because these merchant projects generally encounter the greatest difficulty securing early stage capital. They have to advance permitting, right-of-way acquisition and control, stakeholder engagement, environmental reviews. There's engineering work that has to be done. There's all kinds of hurdles that a project has to overcome before commercial arrangements can provide a clear path to predictable revenue generation. And because of that, private lenders are more likely to be hesitant to participate in earlier stages. And equity financing could really be stretched thin, it could be expensive or just difficult or possibly like impossible to access. Due to the higher risk nature of these early development activities. And CETA is really well positioned to help address projects that fall under this use case. As an example, CETA could provide milestone-based or delayed draw revenue bonds. They could provide patient, kind of smaller risk commensurate appropriate capital earlier on in the development process. And align capital with the appropriate stage of the development process in which we're at. And we'll talk about this a little bit more on the next slide when we dive into how CETA might think about actually structuring its bond product. But what's important is that these tools can improve timing alignment and make capital available earlier than capital markets typically would. And this reduces dependence on dependence on solely expensive development equity. It could possibly even enhance a project's perceived viability in the eyes of land stakeholders and communities, future utility owners. And then once key project siting and permitting milestones are achieved in those earlier stages, the project's risk profile improves and kind of speaks to that changing risk profile over time that Soam mentioned at the beginning of our discussion here, and ultimately enable a transition to lower cost private capital or standardized or more standard financing norms later on in the development process. With our second use case here, we see an opportunity for CETA to provide transitional or bridge financing for merchant build-own transfer structures. So again, recall that in those merchant build-own transfer models, a developer will advance a project before ultimately turning it over to a utility for placement in rate base. And so even when the long-term revenue model is secure, with the placement of that project in rate base, the period between late-stage development and transfer to the utility often experiences capital gaps that may result in developers leaning on higher cost bridge financing. And CETA has an opportunity to help smooth this challenge by providing structured bridge financing that is flexible and patient and can really accommodate the uncertainties of that are raised in this gap period. And again, in a similar fashion to use case one, CETA can help align capital availability with project timing, reduce the need for higher cost late stage equity, and just strengthen execution confidence for the project overall and for utilities by ensuring that it reaches transfer in a timely and orderly fashion. And then finally, we have our third use case here, which is that CETA has the ability to provide targeted support for regulated incumbent or competitive projects in select and defined circumstances. So while regulated utilities and competitive developers participating in cost of service models generally will have access to lower cost capital, there are some circumstances that we've identified where CETA's bonding authority could provide incremental and selective, well-targeted support. In the regulated incumbent context, for example, CETA might advance earlier stage activities for projects that provide those broad public benefits that fall under CETA's mandate for advancing reliability, economic development, and policy goals. But these projects might fall lower on a utility's capital priority list or face some kind of delay tied to planning cycles. And CETA can also, in the regulated competitive project, kind of tie or advance these like discrete public benefit upgrades by strengthening competitive bids by supplying capital aligned with project timing and development milestones. For competitive bids, this could help improve a project's financial competitiveness. It could reinforce execution credibility and just overall contribute to an increased likelihood that a project might be selected in a competitive solicitation. And although these applications for the regulated models in buckets number one and two are narrower in scope than the applications for the merchant models in buckets three and four, we believe that this use case number three really speaks to how CETA's bonding authority might strategically complement private capital without displacing utility investment. So I really want to highlight this point on the next slide here, that point around the fact that public financing can complement private capital, but it's not necessarily a substitute for the debt and equity financing structures that underpin existent utility economics. If you were to substitute utility equity with CETA bonds, you might not significantly reduce customer rates, unless those bonds were backed by a state guarantee and were general obligation bonds. But recall that CETA has the ability to issue revenue bonds. And because of that, these revenue bonds aren't backed by the full faith and credit of the state, and therefore would likely be treated as capital markets, but by capital markets as a non-recourse obligation. And as a result, substituting utility equity with CETA bonds may not reduce customer rates and have that intended effect, but may instead introduce added complexity without the desired cost savings. So really, I just want to emphasize this point here at the bottom that our thesis is that CETA's value proposition is not in artificially lowering the cost of inherently risky capital, but really it's in providing strategically structured, mission-aligned capital that helps viable projects, select viable projects, advance to the point where in their development process, where private financing becomes more accessible, becomes feasible, and becomes more affordable. So I said earlier that we would touch on how CETA might think about structuring its bond product offering. Um, and our belief is that CETA can structure its bond products to match project risk and revenue timing, while signaling having the additional benefit down at the bottom here of potentially signaling public purpose for a project to drive, build trust and drive stakeholder alignment. So one of the most effective tools that CETA can use, as you see here up top, is milestone-based or delayed draw financing. So instead of providing the full amount of capital up front, the bond authorization, the CETA bond authorization, would instead allow proceeds to be drawn only after the project achieves predefined development steps, such as securing capital permits, completing rights-of-way acquisition, advancing to notice to proceed, initiating construction. Um, and if one of these milestones in that Chevron timeline that I had 3 slides ago is not met or is not reached, um, then or experiences delay of some kind, then the remaining undrawn bond proceeds would then be withdrawn. And what this structure does is that it does two main things. One is that it allows the developers of the project to reserve a long-term capital source while avoiding interest expense on idle cash balances. So it would reduce negative carry, where developers would basically otherwise be um, uh, uh, accruing interest on these undrawn funds that aren't being put to productive use. And then secondly, this structuring of the bond product, this offering would protect investors because funds would only be deployed and released at given milestones, therefore meaning that funds are only being deployed as the project progresses and as risk declines. Second, we have here that CETA can align repayment of bonds with revenue ramp up for a project. So you can see here we characterize this as revenue aligned repayment, given that transmission lines typically don't generate revenue during years of construction, and this can create cash pressures on a developer if debt service obligations begin immediately. CETA could potentially structure a bond product such that it incorporates capitalized interest or interest-only periods into its bonds, so that repayment obligations only arise once the project fully enters service and begins generating revenues. This capitalized interest works in a way such that it allows the unpaid interest during construction to be added to the principal balance that's repaid once revenues begin. And interest-only periods operate in such a way, they serve a similar purpose, in that they keep debt service requirements minimal until there's a cash flow available to support repayment. Um, and then finally, in this third bucket here, we see that CETA has the ability to potentially use its authority to help improve the financing environment for smaller entities that may just have a more difficult time achieving scale on their own. Many Colorado municipal utilities, electric cooperatives, and local authorities face they face really urgent transmission upgrade needs, but may not be able to easily issue debt in a cost-effective manner just due to the relatively smaller project sizes that they have. And what CETA can do is they can act as a pooled issuer. They can aggregate across multiple smaller transmission investments, um, and aggregate into a single kind of revenue bond issuance that could spread risk across a diversified group of borrowers, and create a bond size that attracts a much broader set of institutional investors in capital markets. And this pooling can yield multiple benefits, as you can see here on the slide. It can help diversify risk by spreading risk across different projects. It might help lower per project financing costs. It might help secure better interest rates because, investors would prefer these larger, diversified, more liquid bond offerings, and ultimately help tap into a broader investor base. And then finally, down below, as I mentioned earlier, um, kind of beyond the direct financial terms of its bonds, CETA has the ability to add value by lending the credibility of a state entity to transmission projects. The public participation of CETA has the ability to potentially improve stakeholder confidence. When a state or a public authority engages in a project after conducting its own due diligence, it sends it has the ability to send a signal to local governments and advocates and community groups that a project has been vetted against and aligned with state priorities and kind of a clear, transparent, and objective process. And this kind of institutional involvement can help these selected projects navigate hurdles and challenges. So, when thinking about how to actually roll out CETA's revenue bonding authority, and deploy and kind of create a roadmap for deployment, we've created this three-part framework to outline that process. In which one, it's really important to develop a standardized approach to bond issuance and bond terms. Two, it's important to develop a successful track record of project execution history. And then three, as initial projects are selected, it's important to remember that there's room for everyone to play in Colorado. So I'll start here with step one of this roadmap, in that for CETA's revenue bonds to gain strong, sustainable market traction, they have to be structured to look similar and feel similar in a way to capital markets and to a large investor base, so that they're seen as replicable, reliable, and standard. And this is because institutional investors typically seek kind of standardized, transparent offerings. So it's just important that CETA establish a product that can be, friendly to investors and therefore replicated for future issuances and reduce transactional frictions and help speed negotiations. Second, or maybe I'll touch a little bit on what some of these features might be. But I think key features that make these bonds palatable to investors could include a clearly defined flow of funds. That is like how project revenues will be generated, collected, and then used to pay the debt service. Well-defined kind of rate covenants and coverage requirements that ensure the project revenues can cover the debt service with a healthy debt service coverage ratio. And then, as I said earlier, it's also really important to build a project execution history. I think there's an interesting kind of chicken and egg problem at play here, in which the lack of project execution history so far, given that CETA hasn't issued any revenue bonds, might create hesitation amongst the investor community and amongst capital markets to commit without a proven track record. And yet that track record is necessary and is needed, as CETA and needs that track record to help build confidence for early issuances. So CETA can help build that track record basically by um, embedding a small kind of standardized public bond component into its early partnerships and projects. So rather than offering public financing as an additional add-on, CETA could potentially make participation in its standardized platform product contingent on allocating a modest share of each project, perhaps around 10%, to revenue bond financing through CETA. And this approach would ensure that every participating project contributes, every project that CETA participates in will contribute to building a portfolio of executed transactions and create kind of a database and a track record that investors can see and look to and help build confidence necessary to scale the CETA model. And then finally, as I said earlier, it's just important to remember that there's room for everyone to play in Colorado, and that CETA's initial bond issuances should target projects that fill gaps rather than compete with Colorado's incumbent utilities. Now, I want to provide an example use case of what this might look like over the life cycle of an illustrative project. So for use case one, recall, it's that CETA can provide selective early stage development strategic support for emergent projects. And here down below, I have my Chevron timeline from my earlier slide illustrating an example timeline of where CETA might support at two distinct project stages, A and B. In stage A, at the end of pre-development, a project developer might run into some kind of early stage upfront hurdle. CETA has the ability at this stage A to, if this is a select project that they decide to engage in, perhaps provide the project developer with a selective small amount of milestone-based capital, a few $1 million just to help fund permitting, environmental compliance, or another hurdle of that nature. As the project progresses through various stages of development, early stage development, late development, and pre-construction, and is getting ready to move into construction, CETA might then re-enter at this stage B and then provide the project with the bulk of the investment, that 10% that I talked about. In, for example, funding $100 million through revenue bonds on a $1 billion project to drive construction and then eventually move into regulated operations. So this the multiple areas in which CETA can engage, I think, is really important to highlight. Like CETA has the ability to engage at stage A, and then once key siting and permitting milestones are achieved with CETA support, CETA can then re-engage in stage B once the project risk profile improves and help enable a transition to lower cost private capital or standard financing norms, which can really only be done if the project is able to actually advance through and past that stage A. And then once you get to this stage B, at this point, CETA can, like I said, embed that small standardized public bond component into its early partnerships to help build a track record. So finally, I'll end on this slide here and just wrap up by saying that public financing offers incremental cost advantages through those tax savings that I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion today, but that its real value lies in enabling transmission projects that could deliver long-term reliability, cost, and policy benefits for the state of Colorado. So in this diagram, the simplified diagram here on the left, you can see a smaller dark blue circle that encapsulates financing benefits and the marginal cost savings that come through state tax exemptions on revenue bonds, particularly, again, for those earlier stage development activities. But much more broadly, in that lighter blue circle, you have kind of large-scale, long-term net benefits that can be brought to bear from project savings on public interest lines. CETA has the ability to help advance these transmission lines that private markets cannot or might not be able to initiate on their own. And the long-term net benefits that are delivered to ratepayers through reduced congestion, through increased access to a more diverse portfolio of generation, or through improved reliability, are far outweigh and exceed the marginal cost savings that might come across through state tax exemption on revenue bonds themselves. So I'll just conclude by saying that public financing, again, should not necessarily be used to replace utility financing to drive affordability through altering cost of service economics, but rather public financing has more of a strategic long-term value in that it enables projects to move forward, which might otherwise stall in development, by funding higher risk, earlier stage merchant activities. Thank you so much, and I will pause here before I turn it back over to Maury and Kathy.
Thank you, Nathan. Gentlemen, we're very appreciative of your insightful analysis and your expertise on this very technical topic. Because of the level of complexity and detail here, we did invite a reaction panel to work through some of the key takeaways and the findings here and just consider how this might apply both for CETA and other jurisdictions. So we'll turn for a few minutes to that reaction panel. These are folks who are working on public financing in other forums. So I'm going to invite George Lynch, Nicole Pavia, and Veronica Uncono to turn on their cameras. There you are. Thank you very much. I'm going to introduce each of you briefly, and I encourage the Grid Strategies and EnerSites team to stay available. There may be some questions that come back to you, so please stay on the line. I'm going to introduce each of you individually and just a little bit of detail, but would ask each of you to tell us a little more about yourselves and how your connection to this work in whichever jurisdiction you're in. So I'm going to start with George Lynch. He is a senior transmission policy specialist at the Washington State Department of Commerce and also sits on the Idaho Energy Resource Authority board. George, thank you for joining us. If you want to say a few more words about yourself and your connection to this work.
Sure. Well, thank you, Kathy, and thank you to Maury and CETA and Grid Strategies for having me here. So I've been working on trying to build a state transmission authority for about a year and a half now. I'm the transmission lead for Washington Commerce, as Kathy mentioned, and we ran a bill in the 2025 legislative session to try to get a transmission authority developed. It fell just short last session, so it'll be back this session starting next week. So stay tuned. So a lot of this is very relevant to me, and we've also been working on a report for revenue bonding for the Washington Transmission Authority, basically limited to whether a entity like that in Washington is able to issue revenue bonds. So this is a more strategic, practical document than we're working on. But I'm also on the board of directors for the Idaho Energy Resources Authority, which is not a transmission authority, but it's a pure financing authority for all sorts of energy projects, generation, transmission, distribution system, anything. So we use revenue bonding also in a similar way. And prior to that, I was legal counsel in the Idaho Governor's Energy Office for a number of years, and between that was at the DOE Grid Deployment Office.
Thank you, George. We appreciate your participation here and bringing your experience. I'm going to turn to Nicole. Nicole Pavia is Director of Clean Energy Infrastructure Deployment at the Clean Air Task Force, and she's been busy in the New England region. Nicole, thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for having me, GridWorks, CETA, Grid Strategies, EnerSites, and thanks for that amazing presentation. Like Kathy said, my name's Nicole Pavia, and the program that I lead at Clean Air Task Force works to identify and overcome non-technical barriers to infrastructure. So these barriers include things like siting and permitting challenges, social acceptance of infrastructure, and financing, among other things. So over the past couple years now, we've been working on um, projects across the country with partners to better understand how public financing mechanisms and also public-private partnerships can be deployed to reduce the cost of transmission build out. So we conducted a study with our partners Net Zero California and UC Berkeley. In California on the potential impacts of public financing on transmission development in that state. And we found potential savings of up to $3 billion a year when leveraging alternative types of financing, public-private partnerships, fully public financing, when compared to the status quo utility financing in California. And we are embarking on a similar project, but of course different because California, the ISO there covers one state. Now we're moving on to New England, covering several states within ISO New England, but exploring some of the mechanisms that might be available in a multi-state region. And one other thing I wanted to mention was that we're conducting work with CETA right now on identifying and socializing where and how developers can best coordinate with CETA and vice versa. And so I think this financing piece is going to be a critical part of that work as well, and will fit in nicely. So I just wanted to thank this team for this really important research project.
Thank you, Nicole. Grateful for your experience here too. And Veronica Uncono, a Clean Energy Legal Fellow at the Environmental Defense Fund, and has been working on revenue bonding in some of our Great Basin states. Veronica?
Thanks, Kathy. And hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm Veronica Uncono. I'm an attorney for Environmental Defense Fund, and I lead our Southwest transmission advocacy, including before CETA. And so the goal of our advocacy, right, is to balance environmental protections with the development of a power system that anchors economy-wide decarbonization, increases affordability, and really maximizes grid performance. And we're excited to see CETA explore implementation of their financing authority, especially given the prioritized projects from last year.
Thank you. And I'm going to keep this conversational. So just a couple questions here to highlight some of the findings and do a little compare and contrast given your work in other areas. First question for you, and maybe I'll start with Nicole, since you've done quite a bit of research both in the California and now applying it into the New England. What findings from the white paper resonate for you, and what are the key takeaways that you carry from the presentation today?
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. So I think first of all, CETA and other public entities, transmission authorities have really important roles to play in transmission development. Utilities are critical to the development of transmission infrastructure across the entire country and Colorado, of course. Are a lot of structural challenges that have been explicitly mentioned in the presentation and also alluded to that have prevented much needed transmission from being built. So, for example, lines that are needed might span multiple utility territories. It's difficult to coordinate that. Or, demand centers in Colorado might want to leverage resources that are available outside of Colorado in a neighboring state. And so the current system is not really set up to support the development of lines for those really important purposes. So without CETA, the need for these lines, one, might not be sufficiently even prioritized or recognized or known, both to merchant and utility developers. But also, significant gaps would remain in the grid, which contribute to a whole host of issues, including congestion, but also harming the chances of important goals that Colorado has, like decarbonization, for example. So, attracting private sector investment for higher risk projects or projects that otherwise would not be constructed, I think is a really, really important function of CETA and of public entities in general working on transmission. And the state via CETA can encourage and drive investment in these really high value projects. And as Nathan also mentioned, this also signals intent for these projects to reach really important milestones, which I think is a critically important feature as well.
George, in Idaho, has that been your experience with the bonding projects you've seen? Does it attract the private investment capital as at critical points?
Yeah, well, I mean, Idaho uses it a little differently. So like what kind of struck me about the report was really the targeted and strategic nature of how revenue bonding can be used. I've seen it in a different sense in Idaho. There's a perception, when I talk to stakeholders in Washington about transmission authority that the revenue bonding can save ratepayers a ton of money and have a big effect on project and ratepayer costs. But in Idaho, it has been used in a much more strategic, tailored kind of way to serve other purposes to get projects off the ground. So, for example, Bonneville has used the Idaho Authority to finance projects in order to keep debt off of their treasury balance sheets. So it allows them to do more projects that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. And then some COUs have used the Idaho Authority um, because it's a more it was a more streamlined, easier way to use bonding from a state entity than to use their own revenue bonding. So the projects I've seen have also been um, really targeted and practical in nature and not in order to save a ton of money on the project costs and ratepayer costs. So this report definitely is consistent with my experience, but it goes into it comes up with a lot of other strategies that I hadn't thought of for the for the early stage development for merchants and the bridge financing and support it could provide for some IOUs. In Idaho, IOUs haven't really used the authorities financing capabilities. So yeah, it's really this sort of innovative strategic nature of the financing that's really stood out to me in this report.
Thank you. Veronica, what stood out for you?
Thanks, Kathy. And similarly to George, the strategic use contemplated here really means that CETA can develop measurable outcomes for their capital deployment, which can then provide transparency for the public, for the legislature, and then provide real clarity for developers, right, as to how and when that capital may be available. And truly, there are few instances in transmission development where transmission developers have more certainty. And so CETA has a real opportunity here to create more of that certainty by minimizing project risk. I think moving forward, it will be important for CETA to define those qualification requirements as clearly as possible. And it sounds like that will be the focus of the next year.
Mhm. For sure. Yep. Thank you. Yep. And those standardizing the project and developing the project execution history that Nathan referred to. Yeah. I want to return to a point that George referenced of saving customers a ton of money. And I think there is a common theme that public financing will help to control utility rates and can be used as an affordability tool. What we just heard from the Grid Strategies team is that public financing is not a substitute for utility debt and equity, but a complement to. And there isn't that direct through line to customer rates. And just want to pause on that a little bit. And what is your reaction to it, George? I think you already gave us a little bit of a hint, but is that a surprise to you, Nicole, given your work in California, or Veronica, what you've seen?
Yeah, I would say I think it is not necessarily surprising, but I do think that it serves to highlight the variety of public financing mechanisms that are out there, and the varied applications of those in different states and regions. So, like for example, in California, there is authority, for example, to use geo bonds and other types of financing mechanisms. Um, Looking at the Colorado case specifically, revenue bonding is the tool that is available, which brings, with it different pros, different cons, different attributes. So it's just important to think about that as people think about, applications beyond the state of Colorado. But I think one thing to mention too, and I know the presentation did allude to this, but many studies, including the DOE transmission needs study, among others, show that though while while public financing might not lead directly to ratepayer savings, it can facilitate the build out of more transmission, which does help to alleviate system congestion, and prevent, artificially high prices from kind of aggregating in spots where there isn't any room to get electricity in or out, which can help reduce overall system costs and make the system more efficient. So, there are benefits generally, even though they might not directly one-to-one accrue to ratepayers, that I think are just important to reemphasize.
Mhm. Yeah, yep. So that overall, the project benefits the public interest lines versus the incremental savings on the financing costs that Nathan referred to. Veronica, what's your reaction to that?
I agree. It makes sense that there's no direct causation to lowering customer rates with this type of public financing. This public financing mechanism's function really is to create the conditions for a project to be developed, and then that project is what's going to produce those benefits. And that's at least how I think about it in sort of incremental steps. That makes it a little bit clearer and also clarifies where that direct causation actually happens.
Yeah. Yep. Thank you. And I also, Nicole, I want to emphasize on your comment, the variety of financing mechanisms. I think the California work, and correct me if I'm wrong here, was in a competitive solicitation environment. And Colorado, we are looking at projects as the opportunities arise. So a very different setting, different mechanism that CETA is looking to employ than what might be in California. And then
Yeah,
that question of timing. Good. George, anything you would add on the cost savings, the overall project benefits and customer rates?
yeah, I would say it's not necessarily surprising, but I do think it's a good illustration of kind of the role transmission authorities play in other respects also, and other tools that it has. I hear a lot of feedback from folks who think the state transmission authority is going to be this, behemoth that's running around just willy-nilly building its own transmission lines, and in the Northwest becoming like a mini like state BPA.
Mm.
Where I think with this financing strategy, it kind of illustrates is that transmission authorities aren't meant to supplant utilities and developers, or do their own planning and financing of transmission lines. It's really there to fill gaps, um, and perform roles that are not being performed in the private market, and help support private developers and utilities. Um, so I think, like in the report, one of the key lessons that from Rita that it talks about is it being an institutional platform that can solve problems that the utilities can't otherwise solve. And I think that's a really helpful way to think about it, and probably something I'll use as I talk to stakeholders around Washington at this legislative session.
Thank you. Yeah. Yep. I'm going to do one more question here, and then we are going to turn to the CETA board members for their chance to ask questions of the analysis and the grid strategies and EnerSites team. But before I do, for the three of you, given your own work and the application, I'm glad to hear that this has been useful for other jurisdictions as well. Do you have any questions for the grid strategies team or EnerSites that you would want to clarify?
I guess one thing I was curious about that the report doesn't really address, but I've kind of been confronted with as I have these conversations, is when you issue revenue bonds, will CETA be required to engage in this lease purchase kind of arrangement where it has to take title to a project in order to be able to issue these revenue bonds? Because normally, from my understanding, and this is how Idaho operates also, to issue revenue bonds from a public entity, it has to be a public project. So the issuing entity has to own the project, at least on paper. So they take title to it and then lease it back to the developer until revenue bonds are paid off, and then it's transferred back. Is that how it's going to have to work in Colorado also, or is there another way to do this?
I think you're referring to the Rita experience, right? Where there are lease arrangements that they have engaged in on the public financing. I might look to Soam who's got the RETA experience. Thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm happy to respond, and Maury and others might have more of an understanding of sort of the CETA statute and what's allowed and what's not allowed. At the end of the day, I think the bonds need a very specific security on the other side to be able to support the issuance of the bond. And you're right, George. I mean, I think it generally comes with being able to set up that leasing arrangement and basically say we've got title to the project. And that's kind of similar to how RETA works. I don't know the legal details of how CETA statute is set up, and if in that case, I'm going to refrain from commenting very specifically about that. But in general, what you're saying is true. What I will say though is that it is practical and it is doable. It's not, it's even though there might be a need to set up a lease purchase arrangement, that's all doable. And so one of the thrusts that we have in the report is to essentially, when we say standardize, the idea is to really get industry inputs, multi-stakeholder inputs, including financial institution inputs, to create a product or an offering that everyone becomes familiar with. Once that familiarity is established, then surprises are minimized, and one doesn't have to spend a ton of time each time somebody's issuing a bond, because if it looks like the standard product, and the idea was to create the standard product and then create certain modules that could be implemented in strategic ways when warranted, when there is a project that has a specific risk profile and or CETA's involvement can change the risk profile of the underlying project. Those are perfect opportunities to implement those modules. So I'm answering your question in a bit broader way because I'm not a lawyer and nor do I have the details of the CETA statute, but you're absolutely right, but it's all very doable.
Maury, anything you would add there on the CETA legislation and enabling authorities?
That is one of the questions that's sort of at the top of our list when we hire bond counsel to help us figure out how we're going to create a playbook for issuing revenue bonds. But I do agree with Soam that even if the finding is that legally we need a lease arrangement to make revenue bonding work, I think we know how to do that, right? There's examples of how to do that. So we'll cross that bridge when we get there. As I said earlier, those are issues that we're hoping to tee up here in the near future.
Yeah, and that's how, like I was saying, that's how the Idaho Authority works. So it holds title to all the projects it finances. So we have lawyers that have worked through that. So feel free to talk to them also.
Thank you. And I know our time is short, but I want to make sure that the CETA board members have enough time for their questions. So I will thank the panelists here, and just a quick sort of summation of your comments. It sounds recognize that the variety of platforms for these financing mechanisms and what we're talking about specific to Colorado here as a gap filler and a structured, innovative project at certain timing points in the pre-construction and the development process, and a recognition that CETA's bonding can reduce overall system costs, and those public interest lines bring broad benefits, but the specific cost savings that we're finding here really may be more on as a gap filler rather than as a substitute for utility capital. Thank you all. Really appreciate your time and interest, and would encourage you to stay here. There may be other questions from board members of your experience elsewhere. So really appreciate your time. And from here, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Steve Black, to welcome the CETA board members.
Thank you, Kathy, and welcome all. Happy New Year. Really appreciate the presentation and the work, Rob, that you and your team put into this white paper. And Nathan, thank you for the very thorough presentation, and so now that you've had time to digest all of this, and to the reaction panel, thank you for sharpening the focus on some of the key takeaways. We want to turn to the board members who are present. I see about a half a dozen of you. So given the presentation, given the white paper, given the use cases that have been highlighted, now is an opportunity to react, ask questions, get additional information, or highlight potential opportunities. So with that, we want to turn to the board. And if you'll just raise your hand or put a comment in the chat, I will recognize you. We have about 20, 25 minutes, I think, Kathy, is that right? Before we turn to the members of the public. So, Carl.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah. Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it. I'll be quick, and this is kind of high level because I'm eager to hear other people's questions and answers to those. But when you look at this presentation and you think about the purposes of CETA, altogether, everything CETA wants to do is significantly risk reducing for these kinds of projects. Better stakeholder engage, or we're trying to epitomize better stakeholder engagement. We're having partnerships that diversify risk. We're achieving a low carbon, reduced carbon, all renewable energy future. How is there any serious, non-naive hope that all that risk reduction effort can be translated into lower cost financing for these projects to widen the delta and the benefit of CETA based or aligned financing versus conventional financing? I'm just trying to, increase the spread, increase the attractiveness of working with CETA. So maybe it's too pie in the sky, but it just seems to me that at some point, sophisticated markets would recognize that bundle of risk reduction and it would show up in prices for money.
Thank you, Carl. Soam or Nathan, do you take that?
Yeah, no, I think those are excellent points. And, I think you're recognizing the fact that CETA's involvement by itself in a project, and I think Nicole mentioned it as, or Veronica mentioned it as the qualification process. I think if the qualification process and if CETA becomes recognized for their ability to choose good projects, those I think would result in certain benefits that flow through in financing terms. So I'll just step back for a moment. I mean, I think if you think in terms of the projects that are out there, if you look at the full spectrum of the projects, there are those that would go forward no matter what, irrespective of whether they get incentives or support from an authority like CETA. So that's kind of there's not much value add that you could do there. And then there are those that are really not great projects, not well thought through or high risk and or difficult to do, that should never kind of proceed and nobody should really be putting in much money into that. Then there are those, which is this third category, which is kind of in between these two categories of great projects and not so great projects, but in between, which are just on the shoulder, on the cusp, where helping or getting some assistance can help them move to the right side, to the side of becoming great projects for investment and returns. Those are the target projects for CETA. Those are the projects where CETA could actually make a huge difference in terms of their risk profile. And to your point, that risk profile certainly could flow into better financing terms, into more confidence from the market to be able to do certain things, and so thereby resulting in some sort of cost reduction associated with those projects. Now, I will caution us to not assume that that cost reduction is huge, but it is marginal and it is beneficial to the project. And it actually, the bigger benefit comes in from enabling these projects and for them becoming feasible, which they wouldn't have had it not been for CETA's involvement.
Yeah, and I'll just echo that or build on that a little bit. Just to say, sometimes I think in the public discourse, the fact that something is labeled public gets maybe too casually asserted as lower cost for consumers. And that certainly can be the case, and it depends on the specific type of financing. CETA's specific project financing does have some, meaningful benefit. It's more of a marginal benefit, as someone just described. And it's gap filling. And I thought Veronica said it well, and I appreciate all of the panelists recognizing the nuance here, that it's sort of the main advantage is making consumer beneficial lines happen that might not otherwise happen.
Thank you, Rob. Ron.
Yeah, thanks, Steve, and thanks for the presentation and the continuing dialogue on these issues. My The last board meeting, I had just a moment to suggest to the board that we have two challenges coming to us from the PUC's recent energy resource planning order. I think the date was November 6th, if you want to look it up on their website. Two challenges for CETA, one involving the priority project from Craig to Coyote or Hayden to Coyote in the PUC's terms. The other one relevant here is that the commission has asked Public Service Company to either use CETA financing or explain why not for the transmission projects that are related to new resources in their planning. That plan, I think, is going to be filed sometime this year or maybe be delayed the next year. But time to be thinking about how the comparative analysis with and without CETA financing gets done. Do any of the panelists know that this is a settled matter, that either the California work that was referenced by some of the respondents or elsewhere, that everyone knows exactly how the comparative analysis with and without that financing is to be done? I think this is an empirical issue, and we ought to be looking at some numbers here rather than making assertions that it either is or isn't consumer savings. So how do we do the analysis, and what are the sensitive points in there? Should we be getting a standard analysis method in mind so that when this analysis comes up, we've done our work? Thanks.
Thanks, Ron.
Yeah.
Tom?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. And I think the question was for the panelists. I'm curious to hear if in their studies, if anything came up that addresses this. Ron, again, I mean, I think great question. The framework is for that analysis is reasonably straightforward in that when you have multiple financing entities involved in one project, the complexities do go up. And so there is a fixed cost associated with dealing with that complexity, whether it's papering those financing contractual arrangements or figuring out who gets first dibs, first rights, and so on and so forth. So there's just a multiple host of issues, which we are hoping that as CETA starts standardizing the offerings, that some of those get preemptively sorted and we don't have to deal with it each time. So there is a fixed cost element related to, just call it a little bit of higher friction in financing the project. If out of that friction cost, if CETA's involvement is for a very small $10 million contribution or financing in there, chances are that kind of doesn't work because the costs were so high, it was just not worth the savings that could come in basically by getting some of the subsidies on the state tax piece or any of that. Those savings are kind of small, and so I think you would need potentially, in order to just break even from that fixed cost, a much bigger contribution. So the framework is kind of straightforward. There's a fixed cost associated with CETA's involvement. If the size of the issuance from CETA is big enough, where the benefits, which are very marginal, flow through, and those exceed the fixed cost, then it's a good thing to do. And that's kind of when it comes to the utilities. When it comes to the larger portfolio of projects, merchant developers and others out there, that equation changes some because there is an instant credibility that CETA brings to those projects, and that's kind of a different approach and a different framework for that analysis. I'm answering your question, Ron.
Yeah, that helps. Somebody in the banking industry described to me what you just talked about as hair on the deal. So if we're going to have hair on the deal, then that costs money, and we need to compare that with how much the deal saves. So I think that's pretty straightforward. But the other benefits that have been discussed seem to be real, and I don't know how those could be quantified, but it seems to me they could be estimated, and that balance between hair on the deal and the savings could be at least estimated as we think through this.
Agreed.
Nicole, thank you for raising your hand. and your reaction?
Yeah. Because I did mention the California experience earlier. I think generally agree with Soam's analysis. And I think, depending on the market and the complexity of the market and the way that it's set up and the tools that are available, there are, of course, like an increasing number of levers that you can pull in these analyses and, costs and potential benefits and upsides. And I think those things can be measured. I think it's just a couple of things that we learned through our assessment in California. I think one is that in doing those assessments and coming up with those assumptions, it's really important to get stakeholder buy-in from the stakeholders in, transmission developers or regulators, because, once those findings come out and you're like, oh, okay, like there are benefits of X amount, everyone's going to ask, okay, what was your assumption for this? What was your rate here? What was this? So if you have all that well vetted and at least discussed with a wide group of stakeholders beforehand, that's really helpful. And then in the California context, also, I think, and similarly with in Colorado, and I think this has already been very thoughtfully considered at an early stage by this group in this report, but a lot boils down to the implementation. So, for example, in California, there were many different bills proposed over the last couple of legislative sessions as to how to implement public financing and public-private partnerships. There were pilot approaches presented. There were like a transmission authority type new agency presented. And then what ended up happening was there was the establishment of a transmission investment accelerator, which helps to streamline funding and bring funding in from other sources to go to transmission. But authority has just been established, and I think there's still a lot of things to work out in the details and how much of those benefits the state will actually see is still to be worked out in the details. So I just wanted to mention that as well, just from the California perspective.
I just want to emphasize a point that Maury made in his opening remarks, which is we'll also, I think, learn a lot from potential development partners about their specific needs, about the benefits of using public financing, and about barriers that they need to overcome. So that's still to come, and there may be an opportunity in that context to quantify specific benefits. Other members of the board, we have about 10 minutes. This has been a fulsome presentation, but if you have reactions and feedback for this team, that would be very useful. Anyone else? Chris or James or Michelle or Nate? Thanks, Nate.
Good morning, everybody. Apologies from calling in from my truck. I'm actually on a transmission right away right now. But as my fellow board members and those who've heard, I appreciate all the educational piece that comes along with this. I think it's going to be key moving forward that CETA helps spearhead which projects we're looking for to help spearhead which direction the state of Colorado is going to go. And I think that's going to be important in finding the right partners that are going to help us develop these projects, and then in turn use that educational process to help educate the folks on some of this revenue avenues that we can take. So I just want to thank you guys for the presentation, very educational, but I also think it was very educational to let people hear that these aren't huge expenditures to lower the cost. I think some of that is expected when they hear this revenue bonding and sharing, that it's really going to trickle down. And so we just want to thank again that education piece that was presented.
Thank you, Nate. Agree. Other members of the board who are with us this morning? Or Ron and Carl, you've got the floor if you have follow-up comments or questions.
Yield to the public.
Yep, I'm good.
Okay, well, we can do that. Anyone else? Michelle or James?
Nothing, no questions from me. Just a thank you. This is really informative. The white paper is very informative, and we'll certainly be leaning on this as we move forward. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Michelle. Kathy, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll turn to the next portion of our session. That's hearing from the public. And I'll open the floor shortly. This is your chance to ask questions, seek clarifications, and perhaps even just provide some initial reactions. To Nicole's point, it's very important that we hear from the stakeholders and the folks interested in this work, and this is your chance. So I invite you to raise your Zoom hand. I'm going to call on speakers in turn. We do ask you to keep your comments to a reasonable length. We have a pretty full house here, and I know folks have a lot to say, so just be respectful of other folks who may be waiting behind you. So I see Brian Turner, if you want to come on, please, and ask your question.
Good morning, folks, and thank you very much for the presentation. Very educational. I have a question regarding the the version of use of CETA financing to help pool co-op municipal entities. Can you talk more about how that might function? And to put a more another layer of the question on it, could it work with the large transmission utilities in Colorado? Could CETA help the pooling of their capital, and would that alter their capital decisions, right? If we're talking about a project that these utilities have not invested in previously because of their other capital priorities, would participation in a pooling exercise by CETA change that? Could it change that calculus? Does that make sense? So kind of two parts there. I hope it makes sense. Thank you.
I'm happy to get us started, and then others please feel free to jump in. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think as you think about transmission, one of the issues or the reason why we have so many challenges, I know Nicole talked about non-technical challenges, is that transmission kind of doesn't follow franchise territory and or state borders and or regional boundaries, right? The benefits flow to the whole region. The costs can be borne by different folks. And so if there are smaller co-ops who can think about or know of some larger transmission projects that could benefit all of them at the same time, by themselves, it's a big struggle to be able to figure out how to participate, how to enable that, how to make that happen. And so that is clearly a use case for CETA where they could potentially come in through the CETA standardized offering and be able to pool their resources towards benefit or towards a project that benefits the overall region and multiple co-ops and multiple entities that by themselves they couldn't have. So I think that's absolutely a use case that we've identified. To your point about whether or not the same applies for utilities, I think the answer is yes, but in practice, I think it's a bit more challenging. The utilities have very specific mandates to essentially create infrastructure and do everything that they can to serve their franchise territory in the most lowest cost and the best, most reliable manner. And so when it comes to things that go over multiple utilities and or, in our words, that goes over seams, even from one control area to another, those equations become pretty complicated. We've tried efforts where we try to pool utilities together to do certain things, and those processes are very challenging. And so it's resulted in a birth of an entire industry of developers, transmission developers, who see these gaps and say, wait, if only I could connect point A, which is about 500 miles from point B, and it cuts across multiple regions and multiple counties, couldn't we create a ton of economic benefit? And that's resulted in an entire industry that's kind of basically overcoming the structural challenges of multiple utilities not being able to necessarily work efficiently to create these larger transmission lines. So I think the use case for co-ops to us is obvious, and it's kind of, I think, more doable. With the utilities, it's certainly workable, but it's practically just becomes very challenging. Rob, I know you have a lot of experience on this.
Thank you. So, Rob, was there anything to add to that? Okay. Okay. And I'm going to go to, well, actually, I see the iPhone. I'm assuming this is the same in the chat here. A question from the chat: might examples of CETA gap transmission projects be those that allow power to flow into New Mexico, El Paso, Arizona, and Southern California systems? iPhone participant, I invite you to come on. Anything you want to add to that before we give it to our presenters to answer?
Yes, and thank you very much for this conference. It's really educational. Excuse me, my name is Ron Belfeld. There was a 20-year scenario request that was submitted to West Connect, and the scenario asks that emphasis be placed on gaining transmission access to wind resources in both Colorado and New Mexico. I would expect that would identify needs and therefore potential transmission projects. I just wondered what role that CETA or New Mexico RETA would play in that process.
Maury, that might be a question for you and some of the regional planning forums. What role do you see for CETA?
Well, I think the nature of those projects, I think we heard earlier from Nicole and other speakers that those multiple jurisdiction, multi-state projects are projects that just have some regulatory and some market hurdles associated with them. And I think we've heard today that, the real value of CETA and RETA and transmission authorities is stepping in and being strategic in addressing some of those barriers. So I think there is a role for CETA and other transmission authorities to investigate those interregional projects and see if we can help move them forward. I know that we're working closely with the folks in New Mexico, talking about some of the projects that have been identified in the Four Corners area, and we will continue to do that and see if we can provide value and see if we can help move those projects forward. Does that answer your question, Ron?
Yes, it does. It's encouraging, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Ron. And I'm going to go back to the chat here. I don't see any hands, so I'm going to pull another written question from Doug Howell. Very similar vein. How does CETA overcome or address challenges for multi-state projects that go beyond their borders? Maury, again, I might go back to you, and if you have anything to add from what you just previously offered.
I think I answered it, but I would just say that when we were doing our project prioritization exercise, we established criteria for ranking and evaluating projects, and I know that projects that were interregional in nature scored very high in that process. So it's something that we are focused on. It's something that we're looking to again step in and help provide strategic value to move those projects forward. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Doug. Another question in the chat from Alan Best, asking about timing. How soon before these financial tools and the authority can implement them and come to play?
Well, so Alan's going to steal my closing remarks, but so we intend to allocate a significant portion of our state fiscal year 27 funding, so the funding that starts in July of this year, to hiring financial consultants and bond counsel to really help us develop those standardized bond products that Nathan and Soam and Rob have been talking about, and get some of the legal work that was mentioned earlier about whether or not a lease arrangement is required or not. Get some of those questions answered, develop that standardized product so that we can start working towards developing an execution history. Part of developing that execution history is going to be talking with our partners, our development partners, and asking them what challenges are they confronted with, and what issues do they face, and how might we use our authorities and our revenue bonding authority to unlock some value. So that's coming. I would expect that we will hit the ground running in July, maybe earlier, if we have some excess funding from this state fiscal year. But certainly, it's a top priority for the next fiscal year starting in July. So I hope that answers the question, Alan.
Thank you, Alan. Eric, let's go to you next, and then Jacob will follow with you.
Thanks very much. I'm Eric Obo from New Mexico Renewable Energy Transmission Authority. And a couple things. One clarification, in Nathan's presentation early on, he indicated that the Western Spirit transmission line was included in the rate case in that build-own-transfer arrangement. It's not entirely accurate. One of the substations was partially included in the rate base, but because that line was developed by Pattern Energy, and Pattern Energy also developed a wind farm and was shipping 800 megawatts of wind through that line to markets in California, it was kind of no cost to the New Mexico ratepayers. So PNM recovered the cost of that line in wheeling. So just a quick clarification. The question I have really is about qualification of projects. I just looked up your 2024 final report for your transmission study, and there's $4.5 billion in 2024 dollars of greenfield rebuild and reconductor projects on there. And I'm wondering, what is your expected qualification process? We're in a state where our marketing plan is to pick up the phone. And so I'm just wondering what is the anticipated qualification process? And maybe that's to be worked out, but I just wanted to see if there's anything there. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Eric. Maury, I think back to you.
Yeah, so Eric, thank you for that question. Unfortunately, CETA does not have deep pockets to do a lot of due diligence on our own, right? And so we really need our partners and partnership agreements to help us finance a lot of that due diligence and a lot of that vetting. And so, we prioritized the projects that we identified in our 2024 study. We identified 6 priority projects. We put those out as an announcement to potential developers. Hey, we're interested in doing further due diligence on those 6 projects. But we were very clear that we will help with due diligence on other projects that are of interest to developers as well. So it wasn't as though we were just exclusively focusing on those 6 projects. But I think that's the mode that we're in. For us to do due diligence, we need a willing and active partner to help us do that. And that's the stage that we're at. Does that help, Eric? Okay.
Thank you, Maury. Jacob from WRA, and then we'll go to Brian Turner next.
Yes, thank you, Kathy, and thank you, CETA and Grid Strategies, for that wonderful report. Learned a lot. So kind of building on Eric's point, Maury, if you don't mind maybe addressing this, do you anticipate like a public process for like maybe what factors CETA is going to prioritize for which projects to move forward with? Similar to the project prioritization process that happened last year.
So, Jacob, we may do similar prioritization efforts in the future, right? We may do follow-on studies, and we may do some additional prioritization. And if we do, I think we are committed to, engaging with stakeholders and getting their input on the criteria and the factors and which projects they would recommend that we move forward with. So, repeating the process that we conducted back in July, I think we're committed to doing that. In addition, one of the reasons that we are not able to prioritize the development of standardized bond products right now, and we have to wait until July, is that we have another initiative that we're currently working on. In our enabling legislation, we have a public notice requirement before we enter into any project, right? And one of the triggers of that public notification requirement is using our revenue bonding authority. And so I have the draft right here. Our attorneys have been working hard over the last 4 or 5 months to sort of put the meat on the bones for that public notification process. That process does two things. It allows the public and stakeholders to weigh in on the need and benefits of projects that we are anticipating moving forward with. And it also allows the incumbent utilities to sort of step into our shoes and say that they have those projects. Um, we've got a draft policy in hand. We're going to do some further internal vetting of that draft policy, but then we're going to put that public notification policy out for public comment. We're going to hold a study session. We'll have the attorneys walk people through it. We'll open up a written comment period. You'll be able to provide written comments on the policy itself. But then when we actually implement the policy, Jacob, that's where I think stakeholders will be able to weigh in and comment on the need and the benefits and the impacts of projects that CETA has identified. So more to come on that. Look for a announcement in the next couple of weeks for yet another study session on our public notification requirement. I hope that
Perfect.
answers the question. Yep.
Yeah, it does. And I just have one more comment, if I may. So, speaking on public disclosures, has CETA considered what documents they'll be making available to the public, around any financing options that they help for or that they provide for projects? And the reason I ask is that after the report, I came to the conclusion that maybe, the amount of financing that CETA would be providing would not necessarily move the needle. But Nathan's example kind of caught my eye in that if CETA provides 10% on a $1 billion project, a 1 or 200 basis point reduction in interest rate, I think is considerable enough that consumer advocates would like to know that and have that information at a general rate case or something similar in front of the commission.
Let me take a stab at it, and then maybe I'll ask Soam or Nathan to jump in here. But I think when it comes to the standardized bond products that they're recommending that we develop and that we use with our market offerings, I think those need to be transparent, right? Those need to be transparent. They need to be visible, and so I'm anticipating that we will share those standardized revenue bonding products with the public and with investors, right? So I think that will be made available. When we go to implement specific revenue bond financing with a specific partner, there may be aspects of that agreement that are proprietary and that we don't make public. But I think that the standardized products will certainly need to be made available and need to be transparent. Am I getting that about right, Soam?
Yeah, no, I think the structure and overall sort of what the terms look like should be pretty reasonably transparent. And you're absolutely right, Maury. When it comes to specific projects, depending on the developer, depending on whether it's in a regulated situation or whether it's in a competitive situation, some of that may have to be held confidential.
Great, thank you all.
Thank you, Jacob. Turning to Brian, and then Kate, I also see your hand. You're next. Thank you, Brian.
Great. Thank you for letting me ask another question. This one's quite different about markets. My understanding is, and it's two questions in one because we've got day-ahead markets. My understanding is that probably doesn't change your basic conclusions here very much, might change the revenue forecasts as day-ahead markets change how lines are utilized. But entering into SPP RTO, seems like it would create a whole lot more changes to the structure we're talking about here. At the very least, new lines will be subject to SPP's competitive solicitation process, or, can I ask what your impressions are of what those two different market opportunities or eventualities for Colorado affects in your conclusions?
Yeah, again, I'm happy to jump in. I mean, look, the way I see it, the day-ahead market, as you rightly pointed out, adds to the transparency and makes more revenue sources, more value creation understood in a more transparent manner. So I think that's a positive for the market reflecting true economics. Some of this is about the market metrics don't necessarily reflect the true benefits to the consumer because some of it is not, so-called, it doesn't fit the spreadsheet model, so to speak. And so I think having some of those finer metrics around economics is a good thing. Regarding the SPP procurement and competitive procurement, I I look, I mean, I think those competitive procurements have been around forever. They have uh, recognized the need to build a lot more transmission, and there are two dynamics, and I'm not going to comment specifically about SPP, but there are two dynamics that are kind of unfolding across the country, across all the ISOs and RTOs that are running these procurements. One is the need to kind of build things quickly and be able to get it done, and sort of relying on existing incumbent utilities and their ability to get things done. If you're kind of upgrading a substation that a utility already owns, does it make sense to necessarily have competition in there? So that's kind of one dynamic playing out, which is kind of let's kind of build everything and lean on existing incumbent folks. The other dynamic that's playing out is, are we really being able to, are we creating new infrastructure at the most cost effective or most economic point for ratepayers? And have we seen issues where we've just awarded something to the incumbent utility and the project might have in planning stages costed 300 million, and then when the utility is done with it and built the whole thing, it's kind of costing 450 or 500, and so that's the other dynamic that's playing out. These two are competing dynamics on getting things done quickly and on figuring out what specific projects should be subject to transmission, including the incumbents get to participate in those things. So those are two dynamics that are playing out across the whole country, and I'm sure that's playing out even within SPP. I don't want to sort of specifically comment on SPP. These are tried and tested processes. They've been going on forever, and they kind of work.
So Kathy, I'll chime in and just say that Brian, I think the thing that the market development in the West does, and especially the SPP RTO West does, is it creates more opportunity for CETA to participate in the competitive bidding solicitation as a partner with a developer. And I'll just throw out an example. I had a call yesterday with a developer, and their specific ask was, would CETA be willing to partner with us to submit an application into a competitive bidding process? That's not something that would happen absent. Well, let's just say SPP RTOS provides another opportunity to participate in that way, and so we're interested in exploring that. We don't have a definitive answer on how we would do that. I know that the New Mexico RETA has some experience doing that. We'd certainly want to learn from their experience and figure that out going forward.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. I'm going to turn to Kate, and then I have a couple questions in the chat that we'll take. Kate?
Okay. I'll try to be brief with this. But my question is about the with the lease arrangements we've been talking about that are more common potentially, with RETA and in Idaho. And thinking about how these authorities, because they're associated with the state, it really provides more certainty. It seems like it provides a lot more security for engaging institutionally, right? Either with local governments, maybe with legislators, maybe with local landowners. And I'm wondering if it seems to me it's this perception that the state has some ownership, right? And that gives you a long-term entity with whom you can be always dealing with, right? If there's a due diligence question, a maintenance question, you know who to reach out to. And I'm wondering, if you don't have that arrangement in place and you say, no, the state's not going to own anything, does that make it more difficult for those kinds of for that kind of engagement? And are there other things that should be considered if so, are there things that should be considered as part of, okay, well, the state's not the long-term owner, but here you will have some of this security, right? Or you'll have some of this like through line. So you're not just like, hey, who owns this line that goes through my property, right? Like, who do I call if it starts a fire? So I'm just sort of wondering. I know it's a little convoluted. It might be. It sounds like maybe answered in some future study sessions, but I just want to raise that right now since it does relate to the ownership and financing question.
Maury, I'm going to look to you here.
So yeah, I've got two thoughts, Kate, and it's a great question, and I understand your the issue and the concern that you're raising, right? One way that we have grappled with that issue is that you'll recall we created some community engagement principles. The board adopted those principles 2 years ago, and one of the principles in that set of principles is that there needs to be a long-term durable commitment and point of contact so that long after the project has been energized and put into service, if issues arise, there's a point of contact that the communities can go to make sure that their issues are resolved and addressed. So that's one small way that we've tried to grapple with that issue. The other thing that just comes up in my mind is that if you look at the enabling legislation for CETA, I mean, it was always contemplated that CETA would eventually transfer ownership. We are not a long-term owner of transmission, right? The legislation, I think, gives us a 10-year runway before we have to transfer ownership, but CETA was never intended to be the owner for the life of the transmission asset. We were always intended to transfer. Now, just because we transfer ownership, maybe there is some role for CETA even after we transfer that ownership to be that point of contact or that entity that you're talking about. But we'll just have to keep focused on that issue and make sure that it doesn't fall through the cracks. I understand what you're talking about.
Thank you, Kate. Jacob, I see your hand, but I'm going to take a couple that have come in earlier in the chat. First from Pam Eaton. Thank you for joining us. I invite you to offer this yourself, but I'll read it for you. Wondering if CETA is contemplating financing for reconductoring, or is CETA's financing most valuable for greenfield projects? And might turn to the grid strategies and the EnerSites folks to start us off.
Yeah, so we've identified reconductoring as one of the use cases for CETA. But in your question, I think your instinct we agree with. Those projects that can move forward without necessarily getting an assist from CETA should move forward. And those projects where they would not move forward had it not been for CETA's assistance are really the highest value added projects for CETA. That does not mean that in a reconductoring project, CETA's involvement does not add value. It does. But that could be potentially marginal or smaller than these other high impact areas. To the extent CETA has bandwidth to deal with both, I say sort of benefit both the projects, go for it. But if we had to really choose between whether we support reconductoring projects versus greenfield projects where we could have a pretty heavy impact, I would recommend the latter.
Thank you, Som. And I'll move on to the next one from Doug Howell, asking about a cost benefits analysis as a part of CETA's due diligence. Does CETA intend to separate out benefits that could go back to ratepayers versus some of the broader benefits I think Ron Lair was asking about and quantifying? When and how will that cost benefit analysis happen in CETA's due diligence process? Maury, I think that's probably for you.
It will happen before we get to the point where we have to do the public notification. We are anticipating that when we provide our initial notice that we're interested in entering into a project, that a detailed cost benefit analysis will be part of the information that we provide in that initial notice. So it will happen at that stage. That's when stakeholders and others will be able to comment on it. What I'll say is that that's something that is going to be developed in partnership with our transmission developers. In other words, again, CETA is not does not have the deep pockets to finance that benefit cost analysis. We're going to have to do that in collaboration with our development partners. And I think the analysis will sort of be tailored to specific projects, right? So I don't think it's going to be a one size fits all universal benefit cost framework that CETA imposes on all of its partners. We'll probably have some benefits that we sort of insist on quantifying, and others that we pick and choose. But it's going to be tailored to the specific partnerships that we enter into. But we do intend to provide benefit cost analysis part of our initial notice when we're planning to enter into a project.
Kathy, can I ask a follow-up of Maury on that?
Sure, please, Doug.
Maury, do you see, I'm not so much worried about the cost because that's better known. It's more the benefits that can be less understood. And do you see that part of the analysis as being an outreach tool? Because so much of the benefits seem to be undervalued, is there a way to use that as a tool to create greater public acceptability?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think CETA is going to have a core set of benefits that we want to, evaluate on all projects. There may be, additional benefits that are specific to individual projects that are quantified. I think having a quasi-governmental entity that like CETA do that benefit analysis and put it out there helps. We do not have a profit motive. We have the public interest in mind when we're doing it. And so, yeah, I think that sharing that benefit cost analysis can add value to the project. At least I hope our partners see it that way, and I expect that they will. Yep.
Thank you. And Jacob, back to you, please.
Yes, thank you, Kathy. Maury, I think this question might be for you. Do you anticipate CETA receiving some level of funding for providing these financing options to help make CETA more self-sustaining, or is CETA going to pursue other revenue opportunities?
Oh, I don't anticipate receiving additional state funding anytime soon, given the fiscal situation of the state of Colorado. Now, our partners or our potential partners may be willing to finance some work on specific bond structures and specific bond offerings, right? So that may be a potential source of funds to develop this revenue bonding authority, as our partners might be interested in it, and they might help develop it in one direction. So we're certainly looking at that opportunity, and so that's where I'm expecting to get the funding to do additional work here. We will use like I said, we will use our state fiscal year 27 dollars. We don't have a lot of discretionary funding, but we will use our discretionary funding to try and build out an initial set of bond documents and a playbook for how to do this. Beyond that, it'll have to be funded by our partnerships to really move it forward.
Gotcha. So, and the reason I asked that is that my understanding is that RETA is self-sustaining. It receives funding from the projects that it helps facilitate. Is that the ultimate end goal for CETA? Something similar, or?
Yeah, I think I mean, you rely on your partnerships early on, and then once projects are put into service, you get some revenue from the operation of those transmission lines. I think, yes, that's the ultimate goal. It just takes a while to get there.
Certainly. No, I appreciate it. Thanks.
Yep.
Thank you, Jacob. And I'll pause for just a minute here. We are just about to the end of our session. I think we've addressed everything I've seen in the chat. Are there any last hands before I bring us to a close? Okay, I'm going to hand it to Maury in just a minute here to kind of give us final thoughts, but I sure want to thank Soam, Nathan, and Rob for their excellent work and very thoughtful analysis and expertise in the field. This is a very technical and complex topic cross transmission development with bond financing, and it makes for a very difficult conversation. So appreciate all of your expertise, and also want to thank our panelists, Nicole, Veronica, George. Thank you for sharing your experience and your insights from other jurisdictions as Colorado tries to blaze this new trail. So with that, Maury, I'm going to hand it to you to close, and just again reference the website where you can find all the materials, white paper, agenda, slide deck from today. Thank you so much. Maury?
Okay, thank you, Kathy. As I mentioned at the beginning, next steps for CETA include hiring some financial consultants and a bond counsel to help us develop those standardized bond products that Soam and Nathan and Rob have been talking about, and to start building a project execution track record. We are going to allocate a significant portion of our fiscal year 2007 funding to do that work. In the meantime, as I mentioned earlier, look for an announcement of an upcoming study session on our public notification requirements, and we'll start working on that effort. In conclusion, I would really like to thank the GridWorks team for their excellent facilitation, and to the Grid Strategies and EnerSites team for their informative and thoughtful white paper. A lot of work went into the white paper and really honing the messages there. They were a pleasure to work with. We really enjoyed it. And we hope that they will continue to offer guidance as we move forward on this important issue. So thank you, Soam. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Steve. Have a great day, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.